Without truth, there can be no justice.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?
We have, Your Honor.
Speak out. Ask those questions. Demand that truth.
Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 25 of Truth is Justice. It's been another interesting few days with respect to the ongoing computer login question. For those of you not on our Facebook page or Bob's Facebook page, the latest suggestion is that I somehow faked the emails from Mr. Devlin, the IT forensic specialist who was a witness for the defence in Sandra's trial. To what end, I have no idea, but I'll get to that in a little bit. How all of this panned out over the last few days is really interesting, and I think it says a lot about some of the people deeply committed to a particular outcome in this case and their specific mindset. For those of you that haven't read Tim's post made a couple of days ago on our page, I recommend having a read of it. I think it provides a wonderful insight into some of the underlying issues that drive some people connected not just to this case, but to many suspected wrongful conviction cases. There's a passion that is quite extraordinary to witness, and no doubt a passion that could be put to good use, but the problem is it clearly gets in the way of rational thinking for some people. Not many of you would be aware, but we get dozens of member requests to our Facebook page from people who have just signed up to Facebook in recent days, some who don't take time to answer any of the 3 simple questions we ask, and some who have few or no friends and the profile is essentially empty. Now, this podcast and our operations in general are really not that technically sophisticated, nor are we guarding information with vault-like security. There's no MIT grad-worthy algorithms at work here, and we aren't trading in state secrets. In fact, the whole point of this project is about being open and transparent and sharing information. Just think about the amount of insight and increased level of understanding that has come from having access to all of the case material, not just snippets here and there released as it suits and only those parts that fit with a particular narrative, all of the information. And my view is that by sharing information, you can get close to the truth, and in these types of cases, surely that is what is most important. Yet, over the past couple of weeks, there have been people close to the case who have been desperate to get their hands on the emails I received from Mr. Devlin. Surprisingly, one of those people has been Liz. And I say surprisingly because a simple request to me or any of the admins, and we would have provided them to her, or a simple request to one of the many members on our page would have got her access to them. But no, I think it was about more than that. I think it was about creating noise and drawing attention to something. It was about the drama. As I said before, I woke up the other morning to news that the assumption now is that the email from Mr. Devlin must be fake. A few people concluded that the only way to explain this whole computer login issue is to arrive at the view that I made it all up. This is literally just a natural progression from where it first began. I must say, a friend told me very early on, in the days after I began communicating with Mr. Devlin, that certain people within certain groups would never believe the material coming out of the conversations that we were having, regardless of how I shared that information with them. And my friend was completely right. Even with the actual emails, some still don't want to believe it. So firstly, why would I lie about it? I understand how it could be of some value to stretch the truth or straight out lie if you were trying to approach this from the perspective of reversing Sandra's verdict. In fact, I think that is exactly what is being done a lot of the time by Bob on his show. You can make up whatever you want. At the very least, it brings attention to Sandra's case and to Bob's show. But in this situation, Sandra has been convicted. She is serving a 27-year sentence, and the interest of Truth is Justice is in ensuring that the full information is out there and accessible to all. That's it. We have no agenda other than the truth. If this podcast was designed to make money, maybe a bit of drama would bring in a few more dollars, and it could be justified on that basis. But we don't make any money from this. Zero. I've come to realise that drama really does work in this true crime and wrongful conviction sphere, as I think Bob has very clearly demonstrated during his coverage of the Melgar case this season. Almost as soon as the drama died off, Bob began winding down his coverage of the case, and the actual public investigation component lasts just a tiny fraction of the overall season. So, on the first question, why would I do that? Fake the emails. I can't think of a single valid reason. And that is the way Bob's followers and Liz should be thinking about it. Seriously, these are the same people who believe they have special skills in investigating murders and tracking down evidence. And secondly, why would I do it that way? Why would I use those words? Read the emails. If after reading them, anyone seriously thinks that I created that response myself, then you have a serious failure in your application of logic. And third, and most importantly, I'm not a liar. That is the whole reason I started this project, because the lies and false and misleading statements offered up by Bob week in, week out were not being challenged by anyone, and they were being accepted by his audience without question. And I don't like seeing that. If you want to win an argument, the easiest and fastest way to do it is to lie. If you want to manipulate people and convince them of something that isn't true, the easiest and fastest way to do it is to lie to them. Telling the truth and providing an unbiased, independent analysis of the facts is the most difficult way to do it, but it is the only morally and ethically sound method. I'm honestly shocked that this whole matter about the computer logins has gone on this long, and the fact it has speaks volumes about what those logins mean for the case. Why else would some people connected with this case be trying so hard to disprove it? I've said from the beginning that the problem is many people, Bob included, are focusing on the wrong thing. Rather than working out how to best dispute the evidence, in this case that someone was actually sitting at the computer at around the time that Jim was murdered, they really should be thinking about what that evidence actually means and work with that to understand the case better. And the more I think about it, the more I actually think that is a commonly used and reasonably effective approach taken by Bob. Dispute the evidence against the convicted person in whatever way possible. Lie about it, misrepresent it, joke about it, ridicule it, distract from what it means, really do anything with it other than actually considering that it is valid and what that means to the case. Almost immediately after hearing about this latest conclusion on the computer logins, I sent a direct message to Liz, attaching copies of the relevant emails. I also encouraged Liz to forward those emails to Mr. Seacrest and to go one step further and request a meeting with Mr. Devlin, face-to-face or over the phone or via email, anything. My suggestion was that she should really just get in touch with him. There is so little to be gained by sneaking around on Facebook pages trying to get information and being involved in gossip and speculation. Go straight to the source and understand the information that way. There are no games going on here. No lies, no publicity stunts, no misrepresentations or misleading statements, no elaborate schemes to try and draw attention to a wrongful conviction. Just the truth and all the information. We are Truth is Justice, and we are setting the record straight. I've heard the term Occam's razor quoted frequently by some of those people who support Sandra, and their application of it really confuses me. Either they are mistaken as to what the term means, or they refuse to consider the realities of the case, or possibly both. Occam's razor is a principle where the explanation of a thing or event is made by applying the fewest possible assumptions. Now, I won't go into the background of it too much. You can do a search on it and find all of that information, but essentially, from a scientific perspective, the principle suggests choosing between competing hypotheses based on the one that is the least complex. It isn't considered a scientific rule or something that should determine and influence your thinking without any other consideration, but it does prompt some very interesting questions, and some which I think are relevant to the way groups like Bob's approach cases like the Melgars. Essentially, for any given phenomenon, the explanation of that phenomenon has a potentially massive range, approaching, or possibly reaching, an unlimited range of alternatives. In other words, other things that could explain the phenomenon. Now, those alternatives can range from the simple to the extraordinarily complex. In the end, there is likely only one that is correct, and from a scientific research perspective, simpler theories are preferable because they can be tested more practically than complex ones. Of course, Occam's razor doesn't just have a place in science, it has a legal relevance, or at least a legal presence, and is readily discoverable in judgments from state to federal courts, with slightly more mentions in federal courts than in the state. And this isn't surprising, because Aristotle made references along these same lines, statements that reflect the same principle. And many legal practitioners will recall their study days, at least partly immersed in the works of various philosophers. So it would naturally follow then that justices refer to these philosophical thoughts in written judgments. Anyway, without going down too deep a rabbit hole, my point about Occam's razor is this. Complex theories, new theories that can be wildly speculative and almost unbelievable, can, because of their very nature, be impossible to disprove. That is where Occam's razor offers us some guidance. Without that, it becomes impossible to reach a conclusion on some things. My view is that the way Bob and many of his followers analyse a case is to use creativity in coming up with as many scenarios as possible and running with them in a way that elevates the likelihood of any given scenario beyond that which is reasonable. Many of the scenarios require such significant leaps that they're dead in the water, literally the moment the words leave Bob's mouth, at least to some people, but others will latch on to the point that a given theory could never actually be proven to be false. Now, take this example, which I think will demonstrate my point, or at least I hope it will. A child is playing with a ball outside a house, throwing or kicking the ball against the wall and catching it or kicking it back. An occupant inside the house hears the ball colliding with the wall, and a short time later hears a window break. The window was right beside where the ball was hitting the wall. Now, the child argues that they weren't responsible for the broken window, and instead offers a complex story of a flock of birds being in the sky at the time, and one of the birds diving down and flying into the window, breaking it, and after being dazed for a few seconds, flies off. Now, what scenario is more reasonable, more believable? And what if the child absolutely insists that the bird flew into the window, and it was the bird that caused the window to break and not the ball? What if the child is usually honest and rarely gets into trouble? Now, it's a simple enough example, but when you think about it a little bit more, it becomes quite interesting. Now, how would you go about proving it one way or another? Now, you could search for feathers, but what if the bird didn't lose any? I'm sure an ornithologist somewhere would be able to confirm that a bird of a particular type would not easily lose feathers in an impact. Now, you could try and piece together the point of impact and see if it matched the ball or a bird, but what if the bird was of approximately the same size as the ball, so the point of impact matched? And what if, coincidentally, a large flock of birds could be seen flying in the sky above the house at that time? And does that make it more likely to have happened? Now, what sort of reasonable investigation could you do to determine that the broken glass was as a result of the ball rather than the bird? You could question the child and maybe encourage them to tell you the full story. Even if they told you eventually that there was no bird and the ball broke the glass, couldn't you then simply argue that the child simply gave the answer you wanted to hear? A wrongful confession of sorts. You could bring in experts to look at the weather that day. You could have specialists look at the angle of reflections from the window and the path the bird may have taken. You could have physics professors study the line the ball would have taken towards the window and the layout of the glass shards to determine the speed of impact, etc. I bet there are many people out there that have witnessed a bird fly into a glass window. I'd say it's a reasonably common event. And do the windows often break? I don't know. I've seen plenty of birds fly into windows, but I haven't seen a window break from the impact. But you could argue that the glass window had some inherent fault in it that made it more likely to fracture. You could even find and contact the manufacturer and see what sort of failure rate they had on the windows. And that's just one small avenue of explanation. There could be an almost infinite number of other explanations. What if the child was briefly blinded by the sun reflecting off the window, and a person in a neighbouring town happened to, at exactly the same time, fire an air gun, and the pellet happened to shatter the window, with the pellet not found because maybe it landed in dense ground coverings under the window? It's complex, yes, but could you prove that it didn't happen? Probably not. So whilst to some people this example may be more than a little bit silly, my intention is in no way to reduce the seriousness of a crime or the investigation of that crime. It's simply to give another context to how you can interpret theories and the possibility of various outcomes. The range of possibilities for any given event is perhaps not far off being limitless, and for every iteration of a potential scenario comes another huge number of infinitely small variables that would potentially impact on the end outcome. So maybe the child actually believes that they saw a bird fly into the window, but maybe it was simply something seen by them on a TV show, and their mind incorporated it into the narrative in such a convincing way that the child believed it. Maybe the child's friend from next door was there playing, and to protect the friend, but also not get in trouble, him or herself, the child came up with a complicated story of the bird flying into the window. Now, my broader point is this. It's absolutely necessary to look at things reasonably, and to accept that whilst the potential for the outliers to happen exists, outliers being those events that can be so wildly speculative that they are ridiculous, it doesn't mean that they could have happened, or did happen, or should really be even reasonably assessed as being a possibility. Now, that isn't the fault of investigators or detectives or the prosecution or the jury members or the expert witnesses or the judge. It's simply the reality. The way to the truth isn't necessarily to come up with an infinite number of explanations for a given event. It is to come up with a reasonable way of explaining a certain event, which in many instances is best done with the smallest number of assumptions applied. Now, over the last 6 months, I've been amazed at the increasingly complex and sometimes truly bizarre scenarios offered up to support Sandra's innocence. From vagrants living in the roof space to a complex nationwide or even international dog theft racket. Now, could either of those wildly speculative scenarios be 100% ruled out to everyone? No. Irrespective of the investigation undertaken, if every single resource were directed to finding the dog racket, to some people you could never rule that out. Could those scenarios be reasonably ruled out to the vast majority of people? Yeah, definitely. For most people, and in most situations. But it very much depends on the observer. That is why we generally talk about how things are from the perspective of a reasonable person. Now, I won't go into it, but the reasonable person's perspective isn't static. It's based on the environment, the situation, the society at the time, the circumstances, etc. But it's largely definable, and often is defined in a legal context. And separate to reasonable doubt, if one did not look at things through the eyes of a reasonable person, and instead looked at things through the lens of any person, then the murdering vagrant living in the roof and the dog theft racket would be theories that would forever be used to demonstrate Sandra's possible, or even likely, innocence. They simply could never, ever be ruled out, because the, I suggest, infinite range of possibilities would always exist. I actually think Bob has helped demonstrate that last point pretty well recently with his discussion of the walkie-talkie use by the Kingwood home invasion intruders. Bob has made the suggestion multiple times that the investigators in the Melgar case failed in some way by not requesting the records from the cell towers on the night that Jim was murdered. Even obtaining those records necessarily does nothing to diminish the defence narrative as Bob has framed it. In fact, I bet that someone could even argue that if those cell tower records showed none of the Kingwood home invasion criminals' cell phones on their data grabs, those individuals would say that it goes some way to proving that they were actually there, because they would have been using walkie-talkies instead. Now, if they grabbed data from the cell phone towers a state away and it showed their phones were active there, The explanation given could simply be that they anticipated the police doing that cell tower search and had friends take their phones at that time of the murder so that they wouldn't be linked to it. Now, it isn't so much a conspiracy theory as much as it is just offering up a whole slew of different possibilities to argue that any of them could have potentially happened. Every single possibility, except the possibility that Sandra actually murdered Jim. And comparing it to my broken window example, the method adopted by Bob and many of his devout followers is one in which multiple scenarios are offered up, some of which would in some way potentially be vaguely plausible, but the vast majority of which can be not definitively disputed because, as is inevitably the case, counter evidence wasn't collected or was simply impossible to collect in a way that could allow the speculative scenario to be suitably countered. What a powerful position to take, really, especially with an audience, at least those who are devoutly following Bob, that are desperate for a wrongful conviction to be proven, or at least proven in their minds. Now, could I successfully argue that the child broke the window with the ball? Yep. To most people, and especially in a courtroom with a jury and the application of facts and the use of experts. And not because I think I would be exceptionally good at doing that compared to anyone else, but because it may be the most reasonable explanation. But I am also equally confident that I couldn't successfully argue that point to a group similar to Bob's devout followers that might be convinced that the bird broke the glass. And regardless of the forum and regardless of the rules around the presentation of the evidence, there would be a group that always and steadfastly believe that I went into the analysis of the matter with tunnel vision and a predetermined outcome. They will say that I never even considered the bird possibility, that I never went through the process of door-knocking neighbouring towns to find the person who had a habit of firing his air rifle in the air, that I didn't scour the dense plant life under the window well enough to rule out a pellet. Now, a question was asked during the week on our Facebook page about whether I'd considered asking Bob for a one-on-one debate or engaging him on taking up the offer to participate in a debate with him on his show. I did think about doing that. In fact, I spoke with a few people about doing that quite a few months ago. I decided that it wouldn't have any benefit to me for various reasons, and one of the most significant being what I just highlighted. Think about who gets the most value out of what we are doing here at Truth is Justice. It isn't Bob's most devout followers. In fact, if you scroll through some of their posts, you see criticism after criticism, with many admitting that they haven't even listened to one of our episodes. They just simply don't like the idea of what we are about, the correcting of false statements and getting to the actual truth without all the showbiz and reveals and bombshells. So that group of people, likely a very small group of people, will not get anything out of what I have to say. So it's doomed from the start. Much like any explanation of why it is the most likely scenario that the child broke the glass window and not a bird, a pellet, or some other explanation from an infinite range of explanations. I thoroughly enjoy a good debate, as I think most lawyers do. I also think I'm reasonably good at it, but there is little point spending time and energy on something when the outcome is predetermined. And any debate with Bob would be, for the most part, for some people in his audience, absolutely predetermined. Anything negative for Sandra would be spun to reflect tunnel vision on my part. And of course, there are the questions that are simply not able to be disproven, such as, how can I prove that Jim wasn't murdered by a vagrant living in the roof? Now, hopefully some of you got to listen to the Crime Junkie podcast episode I mentioned last week about the Eastbourne family murders. And this next part will contain a discussion of that case, so if you haven't listened to it and want to, and don't want any knowledge of it, stop listening now and come back to it when you have. Katie Eastbourne, her husband Gary, an Air Force captain, and their 3 daughters lived in North Carolina. And Gary was away training in Alabama in May 1985. He'd accepted a position in England and was due to start later in the year. And the Eastbournes were concerned about the ability for their dog to handle the quarantine period necessary for the move to the UK, so they placed an ad in a local military newspaper advertising the dog. Now, Gary would ordinarily call the home on a Saturday to speak to his wife and family. He tried to call on one particular Saturday and no one answered. Gary tried calling further times, but his wife still didn't answer the phone. Sunday was Mother's Day, and after getting in touch with a neighbour, it was noted that the family car was in the drive, and the newspapers from the previous days hadn't been collected. Eventually, after a call to the local sheriff, an officer observing the house heard a child crying, and after gaining access to the home, discovered the bodies of Katie and 2 of their children. Their throats had been cut, and Katie was found on the bed in the master bedroom, stabbed 15 times and raped. A young local man, Patrick Cohn, contacted investigators and described how he saw a man early on Friday morning at about 3:30 a.m. leaving the Eastburn family home with a garbage bag slung over his shoulder. And he was able to give a description of that man, what he was wearing and the car he was driving. And he worked with artists to allow a composite sketch to be created of the man that he saw. And back at the house, Gary worked with officers in identifying things that were missing. An ATM card, an envelope containing cash, and a piece of paper with the card's PIN code that were all missing from the house. And Tim Hennis, a 6 6 inch 27-year-old army sergeant, was watching TV with his wife when they watched a news broadcast announcing that a person of interest was sought in connection with the murders. The broadcast included details of the car described by Patrick, a white Chevette. Now, Tim later described how he was shocked to see the news story, noting that it was the first time he and his wife realised that the lady who had been murdered was the one who had put the ad up about the dog, their new dog. Tim, his wife Angela, and their newborn daughter drove to the local station in their white Chevette, and investigators spoke with Tim. He was an almost perfect match to the composite sketch that was created based on the description given by Patrick. And Tim was interviewed for nearly 7 hours and provided a variety of samples: hair, fingerprints, palm prints, and his saliva. And Tim told authorities that he'd collected the dog from Katie on Tuesday and had barely any interaction with her, noting that he didn't even get her name. Now, Tim was an intelligent man. He scored a 128 on a general aptitude test. He was also highly respected in the army. A photo lineup of sorts was presented to Patrick, and he picked out Tim. With a warrant obtained later that day, Tim was arrested and charged with 3 counts of murder and 1 count of rape, confidently noting to the arresting officers that they better know what they were doing. Now, with the crimes committed off base, rather than being court-martialed, Tim was prosecuted by Cumberland County. And Tim's father hired 2 prominent lawyers to represent him against what was an overwhelming amount of evidence. And not just Patrick, but several other eyewitnesses who placed Tim's white Chevette on the same road as the Eastburn home on the evening when the murders were committed. And Tim's alibi was also questioned. It was disputed by one of his previous girlfriends, who claimed he visited her on the evening of the murder. She suggested for romantic purposes, but that Tim left when she declined. Now, other events arguably linking Tim to the murder included the lighting of a bonfire in his backyard a couple of days after the murder, something that he had never previously done and led to suspicion that he was destroying evidence. There was a trip to the dry cleaner with a black jacket, the exact same type of jacket that Patrick described the person wearing when they left the Eastburn home at 3:30 a.m. that morning after the murder. There was an eyewitness placing Tim at an ATM at exactly the same time that Katie's ATM card had been used to withdraw $150, and 2 withdrawals were made from the account, both for $150, which coincidentally matched Tim's rent payment of $300, a payment he made in cash shortly after the second withdrawal. Now, DNA technology was still in its infancy, so while samples were collected, it wasn't possible to use them to their full extent. But despite that, the investigators and the prosecutors were confident that they had their man. Before trial, Tim was offered a plea, 2 counts of second-degree murder, and Tim's response, "I'm not pleading guilty to something I didn't do." The trial in 1986 ended with Tim found guilty by a jury after 10 hours of deliberation. He was found guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of rape. He was sentenced to death. Now, it's noted how following the conviction, Tim took off his wedding band and asked his lawyer to give it to his wife with the message that he loves her. A strange aspect of the case is Tim received a letter following his conviction, which read, "Dear Mr. Hennis, I did the crime. I murdered the Eastburns. Sorry you're doing the time. I'll be safely out of North Carolina when you read this. Thanks, Mr. X." And the author was never identified. Now, Tim's appeal eventually reached the state's Supreme Court, where he was successful in winning a retrial on the back of a 5-2 majority decision, on the basis of excessive graphic photos being shown by the prosecution to the jury, and through that, potentially unfairly influencing the jury's decision. Now, I know I'm doing more than a brief summary of this, but the relevant points, at least the points I believe are relevant to not just the way the Melgar case was reviewed, but wrongful convictions generally, will begin to become clear. So at the retrial, Tim's lawyers presented an excellent defence, systematically attacking each of the prosecution's successful points during the first trial. And the eyewitness Patrick, he was branded a liar and a thief. His criminal history was pointed to, including, in a devastating way for the prosecution, a charge of attempting to use a stolen ATM card. That although that charge was dismissed, it went a long way to discrediting him as a witness. There was also evidence that Patrick had been given preferential treatment by the local police and prosecutors in his various infractions, all things that helped feed something of a conspiracy theory. The defence also attacked specific elements of Patrick's testimony at the original trial, including his recollection that the weather was clear. Expert witnesses were offered up by the defence to suggest that the weather was overcast. Now, they did enough to pretty much nullify Patrick's testimony and his value to the prosecution as an eyewitness. And the letter received by Tim following his conviction in the first trial was read out to the jury, as was a second similar letter sent to the police at the same time. And the woman who remembered seeing Tim at the ATM, that was challenged in various ways, including the bringing up of a statement that she gave to an investigator a short time after the murder, that she couldn't remember anything about that day. Now, Tim was even able to find some new eyewitnesses to support his case. Incredibly, even finding a local boy who admitted to occasionally walking around the neighbourhood in the early hours of the morning. Now, that boy gave evidence at the trial, and devastatingly to the state's case, he looked very similar to Tim, with one of the jurors after the case noting that for him, that was the icing on the cake. The boy looked so similar to Tim that he could have been his brother. So Tim took the stand and was asked why he originally didn't disclose his visit to his ex-girlfriend on the evening of the murder. He simply said that he'd forgot about it. To use his words, "I just didn't place that much emphasis on it. It is something that slipped my mind." And one of the defence lawyers told the jury before they went to deliberate, "They are putting a doggone square peg in a round hole, and it doesn't fit, and it stinks." And the jury reached a verdict 2 days later, not guilty on all counts. So after spending 800 days on death row, Tim was free, and he celebrated by shaking the hands of the jurors and raising his 4-year-old daughter in the air. Now, after his acquittal, Tim went back to the army, receiving various awards and accolades for his service. His superiors referred to him as an outstanding soldier, and colleagues described him as a gentle giant and someone they would leave their own families with. And Tim and his wife went on to have another child, a boy. He was a scoutmaster. He would lead boys on hiking trips and other expeditions and was liked by all. In fact, some believe that Tim's conduct in the years following his acquittal was evidence that he could not possibly have committed the murders. But despite all of that, one important aspect of the case remained untested: the DNA samples from the rape kit of Katie. Eventually those samples were sent off to the crime lab, and the results came back. The sample was 1.2 quadrillion times more likely to be from Tim than any other white male in North Carolina. So Tim's sperm found inside Katie when she was found on her bed in a state of undress and having been raped. Now, Gary's reaction to the news has been described in various ways. He always believed that Tim was the man that killed his wife and his 2 daughters. One description was his belief that the state had the right person all along. Now, the case becomes even more interesting and brings in aspects of double jeopardy. I encourage you to read about it if you haven't already to see how it all developed. I wanted to make a few points about it. So, Tim was a father, an army veteran with outstanding references and nothing but praise from his superiors and his colleagues. His friends and his family thought so highly of him that they would trust their own children with him. And Tim was a man that raised his own daughter in triumph of his acquittal and shook the hands of the jurors. Yet, Tim committed a murder so brutal and so shocking that it is difficult to comprehend. The area where the murder was committed was famous for another murder about 6 years earlier, a case where an army surgeon was convicted of murdering his wife and 2 daughters with an ice pick and blaming it on hippies under the influence of drugs. Now, comparing the case, supporters of Tim's claimed that the police, the investigators and prosecutors had tunnel vision from the beginning and that they were influenced by the surgeon's case, saying they simply used that case as a framework with which to convict Tim. If you can read about the reporting of the case by Mr. Scott Wisnett please do. He covered the retrial and described how prior to the verdict in the second trial, he realised how historic the moment was. A man on death row on the verge of being acquitted. He described how he went from a position of a jury probably won't convict him to a position, after the trial, of Tim didn't even do it. He described how the state's case was so thoroughly dismantled by the defence, and he described the trial as a rout. He eventually wrote a book on the case, but describes how he was somewhat apprehensive whilst doing it. He didn't want to find something that showed that Tim was guilty of such a horrible crime. The book is titled Innocent Victims, and there was about 175,000 copies sold. It was adapted into a television miniseries. And Tim's case was also reviewed by the North Carolina Actual Innocence Commission, resulting in changes to various standards, including those for eyewitness identification. Changes that were all based on the view that Tim was innocent, and the evidence gathered for his conviction was somehow not valid and needed to be changed. Interestingly, a juror following Tim's second trial, resulting in the acquittal, and before knowledge of the DNA finding, said the following, perhaps words that would come to haunt him in the years to come. And referring to Tim, the juror said, and to quote, "Frankly, he looked like he could have been the kind of arsehole who could have done it." End quote. A really interesting aspect to this case is the defence threw everything at all of the various elements pointing to Tim's guilt. Some of the laboratories connected with the one that ultimately tested the sperm sample were under a cloud of suspicion, and then, as a result, even though it was never connected to any wrongdoing itself, the lab that processed the sperm sample was eventually challenged, and perhaps more in the wrongful conviction arena than in actual court. Reading through the case and considering all the different angles, it struck me that the way it was fought was with the exact same techniques that wrongful conviction advocates argue have been applied by the prosecution. Except, it's argued, it's a strategy applied in some kind of better way because it is being used to free someone. It's easy to challenge every aspect of every case, from the safety of a computer chair and the perhaps current popular view that someone is innocent and wrongfully convicted. When doing so, though, consider that the thousands of other scenarios that you offer up may in fact all be wrong, and the right verdict, in many instances representing the simplest explanation of all, may be the one that has already been made. Thank you for listening to Truth is Justice. We look forward to you joining us next week as we continue to set the record straight.